The crisp morning air of Washington, D.C. carried an unusual tension as President Donald Trump prepared for what would become one of the most memorable encounters of his presidency. It was a day that started like any other, with the familiar routine of security briefings and scheduled meetings. However, this particular Tuesday would unfold in ways that no one in the White House could have predicted. The occasion was a rare state visit from a European monarch, an event that had been planned for months with meticulous attention to protocol and ceremony. The visiting royal delegation had arrived with their own security detail, a group of elite guards whose reputation preceded them. These were not ordinary security personnel. They were members of an ancient order that had protected royalty for centuries, men and women whose loyalty and discipline were legendary. Trump had always been fascinated by displays of power and pageantry. The sight of the royal guards in their pristine uniforms, standing at perfect attention with their ceremonial weapons, stirred something in him. He watched them from his office window as they took their positions around the White House grounds, their movements precise and coordinated like a well-rehearsed dance. The guards themselves were an impressive sight. Each stood over 6 feet tall, their uniforms immaculately pressed, their faces stoic and professional. They had trained for years to reach this level of service, undergoing rigorous physical and mental preparation. Their code of honor was strict, and their loyalty to their sovereign was absolute. They had served in conflicts around the world, protecting their monarch through political upheavals and personal crises. As the day progressed, Trump found himself increasingly intrigued by these foreign protectors. During breaks between meetings, he would observe them through various windows, noting how they never seemed to relax their vigilance. They communicated through subtle hand signals and maintained their posts with unwavering dedication. Their commander, a stern-faced woman in her 40s with steel-gray eyes, supervised the detail with quiet authority. The White House staff had been briefed extensively about the protocols surrounding the royal visit. Secret Service agents worked alongside the foreign security detail, creating a complex web of protection that required constant coordination. The two security forces operated under different rules and traditions, but they had found ways to work together professionally. Trump's curiosity about the guards grew throughout the morning. He peppered his aides with questions about their training, their equipment, and their procedures. Some staffers noticed an unusual gleam in the president's eyes as he spoke about the guards, as if he was formulating some kind of plan. His personal assistant later recalled that he seemed more animated than usual, pacing in the Oval Office between meetings. The royal guest was scheduled to arrive for the main ceremony in the afternoon. The event would include a formal reception, a state dinner, and various photo opportunities. Everything had been planned down to the minute, with each participant knowing exactly where they needed to be and when. The royal guards had studied the layout of the White House grounds extensively, identifying potential security risks and escape routes. As lunchtime approached, Trump made an unexpected request to his chief of staff. He wanted to meet with the commander of the Royal Guard detail. The request was unusual but not unprecedented. Heads of state sometimes liked to personally thank foreign security personnel. The chief of staff arranged for a brief meeting in the Rose Garden, where the commander could be summoned without disrupting the broader security arrangements. The commander arrived promptly, her bearing military straight and her expression neutral. She had dealt with many world leaders throughout her career and was accustomed to their various quirks and demands. However, she sensed something different about this particular president. His questions were probing, and his manner suggested he was testing her in some way. Trump began the conversation with standard pleasantries, thanking her for her service and commenting on the professionalism of her team. The commander responded with polite, measured answers, maintaining the appropriate level of respect while keeping her responses brief and to the point. She had been trained never to reveal too much about their operations or procedures to outsiders, regardless of their position. As the conversation continued, Trump's questions became more pointed. He asked about the chain of command, about what would happen if she received conflicting orders, about the limits of her authority. The commander began to sense that this was more than idle curiosity. Her years of experience had taught her to read people carefully, and something in the president's tone suggested he was building toward something specific. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rose garden as their conversation stretched beyond the planned duration. Secret Service agents maintained their positions nearby, but they could see that this was not a routine diplomatic exchange. The commander's responses remained professional, but internally she was beginning to prepare for whatever test or challenge the president might present. Trump's fascination with authority and control was well known to those who worked closely with him. He enjoyed testing the boundaries of his power and seeing how others responded to his commands. The Royal Guards, with their absolute loyalty and rigid discipline, represented something that appealed to his sense of how authority should work. He seemed to view them as the ultimate example of obedience and respect for leadership. The commander could feel the weight of the moment as Trump's questions became increasingly direct. She had served under pressure before, had faced down threats and challenges that would break lesser individuals. But there was something about this encounter that felt different, more personal somehow. She could sense that the president was building toward a moment that would test not just her training, but her fundamental principles. As their meeting drew toward its conclusion, Trump made what seemed like a casual observation about the impressive discipline of her guards. He commented on how they followed orders without question, how they maintained their positions regardless of external circumstances. The commander agreed, explaining that such discipline was essential to their effectiveness. She had no way of knowing that her words were about to set in motion a confrontation that would challenge everything she and her guards stood for. The afternoon ceremony was set to begin in less than 2 hours when Trump made his move. He had spent the remaining time after his meeting with the commander studying the positions of the Royal Guards through his office windows. Each guard stood like a statue at their assigned post, their attention focused outward, scanning for any potential threats to their sovereign who would soon arrive. The idea had been forming in Trump's mind since the morning, growing stronger with each passing hour. He had always been someone who pushed boundaries, who tested the limits of his authority in various situations. The Royal Guards represented the ultimate test of command presence and authority. If he could demonstrate his power over these elite protectors, it would prove something important about his own leadership. Trump called his chief of staff into the Oval Office and outlined his plan. The chief of staff's face grew pale as he listened, recognizing immediately the potential diplomatic catastrophe that could unfold. He tried to dissuade the president, explaining the delicate nature of international protocol and the possible consequences of such an action. But Trump's mind was made up, and his arguments became more forceful as his aide continued to object. The president's reasoning was simple in his view. He was the host. This was American soil, and these guards were operating under the protection of his government. Surely that gave him some authority over their actions, even if they served a foreign monarch. He had seen how military personnel responded to his commands, and he was curious to see if the same principles applied to these international protectors. His staff tried various approaches to change his mind. They pointed out that the guards served a different sovereign, that their loyalty was bound by oaths that predated any temporary diplomatic arrangements. They explained that such an action could damage relationships with a key ally, potentially affecting trade deals and security cooperation for years to come. But Trump dismissed these concerns, viewing them as excuses rather than legitimate obstacles. The Secret Service was quietly informed of the president's intentions, though they were powerless to prevent what he planned to do. Their own protocols required them to protect the president, but they could not control his interactions with foreign dignitaries or their security details. Several senior agents exchanged worried glances, knowing that they might soon find themselves in an unprecedented situation. As the time for the royal arrival approached, Trump positioned himself on the south lawn where several of the guards maintained their posts. The commander had been informed that the president wished to observe the arrival ceremony from this location, which seemed reasonable given his role as host. She had no indication that anything unusual was about to unfold. The guards themselves were focused entirely on their duties. They had spent weeks preparing for this assignment, studying potential threat vectors and coordinating with American security forces. Their training had prepared them for various scenarios, but none of their briefings had covered the possibility of interference from the host government itself. The royal motorcade was still 20 minutes away when Trump approached the nearest guard. The man stood perfectly still, his eyes scanning the perimeter as he had been trained to do. His rifle was held at the ready, though the safety was engaged as per protocol for ceremonial duties. He had served his sovereign faithfully for over a decade, participating in dozens of similar events around the world. Trump stopped directly in front of the guard and spoke in a clear, authoritative voice. His command was simple but shocking. He ordered the guard to step aside from his post and move to a different location. The president's tone carried the expectation of immediate compliance, the same tone he had used successfully with his own staff and military personnel countless times before. The guard's reaction was immediate but controlled. His training had prepared him for many situations, but this was entirely outside normal protocols. He maintained his position and his professional demeanor, but his eyes flickered momentarily toward his commander, who was stationed about 50 yards away. The brief eye contact was enough to alert her that something unusual was happening. Trump repeated his order, this time with more force. He pointed to a location about 20 feet away and told the guard to move there immediately. His voice carried the full weight of presidential authority, and several White House staffers who were nearby began to shift uncomfortably. They could see that a confrontation was developing, but they were powerless to intervene. The commander had noticed the interaction and began moving carefully toward the scene. Her years of experience told her that this situation needed to be managed delicately. She could see the tension in her guard's posture, could recognize the signs of a man caught between conflicting authorities. Her approach was measured and professional, but her mind was racing through possible responses to what appeared to be an unprecedented challenge. Other guards in the vicinity had also become aware that something unusual was happening. Their training included constant awareness of their teammates' situations, and they could sense the tension even from a distance. However, they maintained their own positions, trusting their commander to handle whatever was developing, while they continued to secure the perimeter. The guard, who was the focus of Trump's attention, remained perfectly still. His training had ingrained in him the importance of following the chain of command, but it had also taught him to recognize legitimate authority. The President of the United States was certainly a figure of authority, but he was not part of the guard's command structure. The conflict between respect for a head of state and loyalty to his own sovereign created a moment of unprecedented tension. Trump's frustration was beginning to show as the guard failed to comply with his order. He was accustomed to immediate obedience from those around him, and this resistance to his authority was both surprising and irritating. He raised his voice and demanded that the guard acknowledge his command and move to the designated position immediately. The commander was now close enough to intervene, but she faced her own difficult decision. Directly contradicting a head of state could create a diplomatic incident, but allowing her guard to be ordered around by a foreign leader would violate every principle of their service. She had to find a way to resolve the situation that preserved both diplomatic courtesy and the integrity of her unit. The tension on the South Lawn was palpable, as other White House staff and Secret Service agents realized what was happening. This was not a routine security check or a protocol discussion. This was a direct test of authority between the American president and foreign security forces. The outcome would set a precedent that could affect international relations for years to come. The commander reached the scene just as Trump was preparing to issue his order for the third time. Her approach was deliberately calm and measured, designed to diffuse the tension without escalating the confrontation. She had handled difficult situations before, but nothing quite like this. The delicate balance between diplomatic courtesy and military discipline required careful navigation. She stepped forward and addressed the president with the appropriate level of respect, acknowledging his position while subtly positioning herself between Trump and her guard. Her voice was steady and professional, as she inquired about the nature of the president's concerns. She hoped to redirect the conversation away from direct orders and toward a discussion that might preserve everyone's dignity. Trump turned his attention to the commander, clearly frustrated by what he perceived as insubordination from her guard. He explained that he had given a simple order that should have been followed immediately. In his view, the guard's failure to comply was disrespectful and potentially problematic for security arrangements. He demanded to know why his authority was being questioned on American soil. The commander faced a moment that would define her career and potentially affect international relations. She had sworn an oath to protect her sovereign, but she also understood the importance of maintaining diplomatic relationships. Her response needed to be firm enough to protect her guard's integrity, while respectful enough to avoid creating a major incident. Her answer was carefully crafted and delivered with quiet authority. She explained that her guards operated under specific protocols that governed their actions during diplomatic missions. These protocols had been agreed upon by both governments during the planning stages of the visit. Any changes to security arrangements needed to go through proper channels to ensure the safety of all parties involved. Trump's reaction was immediate and intense. He was not accustomed to having his authority questioned or his orders explained back to him. His voice rose as he insisted that as President of the United States, his word should be sufficient to direct any activities on White House grounds. He pointed out that the guards were operating under the protection and hospitality of the American government. The guard who had been the original target of Trump's order remained perfectly still throughout this exchange. His training had prepared him for many challenges, but standing motionless while two authority figures debated his fate required extraordinary discipline. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air, but his expression remained neutral and professional. Other royal guards had begun to notice the commotion, though they maintained their posts as trained. Their peripheral vision allowed them to monitor the situation while continuing their primary duties. The commander could sense their awareness and knew that her handling of this moment would be observed and remembered by every member of her unit. Secret Service agents were also watching the scene unfold with growing concern. They had protocols for protecting the president, but no guidance for situations where he might be creating a diplomatic incident through his own actions. Several agents spoke quietly into their radio devices, alerting their supervisors to the developing situation. The commander's second response was even more carefully measured than her first. She acknowledged the president's authority on American soil, while explaining that her guard's loyalty was bound by oaths that transcended geographical boundaries. She compared it to how American military personnel serving overseas still followed U.S. command structures regardless of their location. This comparison seemed to anger Trump further. He pointed out that American military personnel would certainly follow his orders if he gave them, regardless of where they were stationed. He challenged the commander to explain why foreign guards should be held to a different standard when operating under American protection and hospitality. The philosophical dimension of the argument was becoming clearer to everyone present. This was not just about moving a guard from one position to another. It was about the nature of loyalty, authority, and sovereignty. The commander represented centuries of tradition regarding the protection of monarchy, while Trump embodied a different view of executive power and territorial authority. White House staff members who had gathered to watch the royal arrival were now witnessing something entirely different. Some pulled out their phones to document the confrontation, while others hurried away to alert senior officials. The atmosphere had shifted from anticipation of a ceremonial event to anxiety about a potential international incident. The commander made her third attempt to resolve the situation diplomatically. She suggested that if the president had security concerns about the current positioning, they could contact the appropriate coordination committees to review and adjust the arrangements. This would allow for any necessary changes while maintaining proper protocols and chain of command. Trump rejected this suggestion immediately. He characterized it as bureaucratic delay and unnecessary complication. In his view, the situation was simple. He had given a reasonable order that should be followed without debate or procedural delays. He demanded immediate compliance and warned that continued resistance would have consequences. The guard himself finally spoke, though he continued to look straight ahead rather than at either of the authority figures discussing his fate. His voice was quiet but clear as he stated that he served at the pleasure of his sovereign and followed the orders of his commanding officer. He expressed appropriate respect for the president while making clear that his loyalty and obedience were already committed elsewhere. This direct statement from the guard seemed to crystallize the conflict for everyone present. The fundamental issue was now clearly defined. Whose authority took precedence in this situation? The president's territorial authority as host, or the guard's sworn loyalty to his sovereign and commanding officer? Trump's frustration reached a new level as he realized that neither diplomatic pressure nor direct commands were achieving his desired result. He had expected the guards to respond to presidential authority the way American military personnel did. The discovery that his power had limits in this context was both surprising and infuriating to him. The commander recognized that the situation was approaching a critical point. Her guard had stated his position clearly, and further escalation would only make resolution more difficult. She needed to find a way to end this confrontation that preserved everyone's dignity while maintaining the principles that her unit represented. As the royal motorcade drew closer to the White House, the timing of this confrontation became increasingly problematic. The arriving monarch would expect to find their security detail in perfect order, not engaged in a dispute with the host government. The commander knew that she had only minutes to resolve this situation before it became a crisis that could affect the entire state visit. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance signaled that the royal motorcade was approaching the final checkpoint before arriving at the White House. The commander knew that in less than 10 minutes, her sovereign would expect to see a perfectly coordinated security arrangement, not a standoff between her guards and the American president. The pressure to resolve this situation was mounting with each passing second. Trump seemed oblivious to the approaching deadline, or perhaps he viewed it as additional leverage in the confrontation. He stepped closer to the guard who had become the focal point of this test of wills, his voice rising as he repeated his demand for immediate compliance. The president's face was flushed with frustration, and his usual confidence had taken on an edge of desperation as his authority was openly challenged. The guard maintained his position with remarkable composure, though the strain was beginning to show in subtle ways. His breathing had become slightly more controlled, and there was a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. He had trained for situations involving physical threats, hostile crowds, and even terrorist attacks, but nothing had prepared him for being caught between two legitimate but conflicting authorities. Other members of the Royal Guard detail had begun to subtly adjust their positions, not abandoning their posts, but creating sightlines that would allow them to observe and potentially respond to the developing situation. Their commander noticed these small movements and approved of them. Her guards were demonstrating exactly the kind of awareness and adaptability that made them effective protectors. Secret Service agents were now speaking more urgently into their communication devices, clearly escalating the situation up their own chain of command. Several senior agents had taken positions that would allow them to intervene if the confrontation became physical, though they hoped desperately that such intervention would not become necessary. The commander decided that the time for diplomatic niceties had passed. Her next words carried the full weight of her authority and experience, delivered in a tone that commanded attention from everyone present. She addressed Trump directly, explaining that her guards operated under a code of honor that had been tested in conflicts around the world and had never been broken. She continued by describing the nature of the oath that each guard had taken upon joining the Royal Protection Service. It was not merely a job or even a career, but a sacred commitment that bound them to their sovereign until death. This commitment superseded all other considerations, including diplomatic courtesy, personal safety, and even the commands of other heads of state. Trump's response revealed his growing frustration with what he saw as unnecessarily complex explanations for a simple situation. He dismissed the commander's words about oaths and honor codes as elaborate excuses for insubordination. In his worldview, authority was straightforward. Those with power gave orders, and those without power followed them. The idea that loyalty could be bound by principles rather than hierarchy was foreign to his understanding. The philosophical gap between the two leaders was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone watching. Trump represented a transactional view of power, where authority derived from position and influence. The commander embodied a traditional view of honor, where loyalty was earned through service and maintained through integrity. As if to demonstrate the strength of the bond she had described, the commander gave a subtle hand signal to her guards. The response was immediate and synchronized. Every guard visible on the south lawn shifted slightly, not abandoning their posts but clearly indicating their unity and readiness to support their commander and their oath. It was the impressive display of coordination and loyalty. This show of unity seemed to surprise Trump, who had expected his pressure to create cracks in the guards' discipline. Instead, he found himself facing a more unified and determined force than when the confrontation had begun. The realization that his authority was not only being questioned, but actively resisted by an entire unit was clearly frustrating to him. The commander seized this moment to make what she hoped would be her final statement on the matter. She acknowledged the president's authority on American soil, while firmly establishing that her guards' loyalty was not negotiable. She suggested that if he had genuine security concerns, they could be addressed through proper channels after the arrival ceremony was completed. But Trump was not ready to concede the point. He had invested too much of his own prestige in this confrontation to back down gracefully. He made one final attempt to assert his authority, this time addressing all the visible guards simultaneously. His voice carried across the South Lawn as he ordered them to demonstrate their respect for American authority by following his commands. The response was immediate and stunning. In perfect unison, every royal guard visible on the South Lawn came to attention, their movements so synchronized they seemed like a single entity. But instead of following Trump's order, they executed a traditional salute to their commander, clearly demonstrating where their loyalty lay. The commander returned their salute with quiet pride, then turned back to Trump with an expression that mixed respect with absolute determination. Her final words were delivered with quiet authority that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of tradition behind them. She stated simply that her guards would remain at their assigned posts until relieved by proper authority. Trump stood silent for a moment, clearly processing what had just occurred. He had pushed his authority to its limit and had been met with polite but absolute resistance. The guards had not been rude or disrespectful, but they had made their position unmistakably clear. His commands would not be followed, regardless of his position or his insistence. The sound of the approaching motorcade was now clearly audible, and White House staff were beginning to move into position for the arrival ceremony. The commander indicated that she needed to return to her duties, and her guards smoothly transitioned back to their original positions and focus. The confrontation was over, but its implications would resonate far beyond this moment. As Trump watched the guards resume their professional demeanor, he seemed to realize that he had encountered something rare in his experience, a form of power that could not be purchased, intimidated, or commanded. The guards' loyalty was bound by principles that existed outside the normal structures of political authority, and this discovery appeared to both frustrate and fascinate him. The royal motorcade was now entering the White House grounds, and the carefully planned ceremony was about to begin. But for everyone who had witnessed the confrontation on the South Lawn, the day had already produced a moment that would be remembered long after the diplomatic pleasantries were forgotten. The royal motorcade rolled through the White House gates with precisely the kind of ceremony and precision that had been planned for months. The arriving monarch, unaware of the confrontation that had just concluded on the South Lawn, saw exactly what they expected to see. Their guards in perfect position, alert and professional, maintaining the security perimeter that had been carefully coordinated between the two nations. Trump stood watching the arrival, his mind still processing what had just occurred. For perhaps the first time in his presidency, he had encountered a form of authority that operated entirely outside his influence. The royal guards had not been rude or disrespectful, but they had demonstrated something that he rarely encountered: absolute loyalty to principles that superseded his own power. The commander had returned to her position near the main arrival area, but she remained acutely aware of the president's presence and mood. Her years of experience had taught her to monitor potential threats even after they seemed to have been resolved. She could see that Trump was still processing the encounter, and she knew that such moments often had delayed consequences. As the royal vehicle came to a stop, the ceremony proceeded exactly as rehearsed. Guards took their ceremonial positions while maintaining their security functions, and the various diplomatic protocols unfolded smoothly. To outside observers, everything appeared perfect, but those who had witnessed the earlier confrontation could sense an underlying tension in the air. The arriving monarch stepped from their vehicle with the composed dignity that comes from decades of public service. They acknowledged the president's greeting with appropriate warmth, while simultaneously noting the positions and demeanor of their protection detail. Years of experience had taught them to read their guards' subtle signals, and they could sense that something unusual had occurred. During the formal greetings and introductions, Trump found his attention repeatedly drawn to the royal guards. He watched how they moved, how they communicated with each other, and how they maintained their vigilance even during ceremonial moments. What he saw was a level of coordination and purpose that impressed him despite his frustration with their earlier resistance to his authority. The commander had positioned herself where she could observe both her sovereign and the president, ready to respond to any development. She noticed that Trump continued to watch her guards with obvious interest, and she wondered whether the confrontation had truly ended or was merely postponed. Her instincts told her to remain prepared for further challenges. As the formal ceremony moved indoors, the security arrangements shifted accordingly. Some guards maintained exterior positions while others accompanied the royal party into the White House. The transitions were seamless, demonstrating the extensive planning and preparation that had gone into every aspect of the visit. Trump found himself walking alongside the commander as they moved toward the interior reception areas. The proximity gave him another opportunity to engage with her, and he seemed unable to resist continuing their earlier conversation. His tone was more curious now than confrontational, as if he was genuinely trying to understand something that had puzzled him. He asked her about the training that produced such unwavering loyalty in her guards. He wanted to know how they developed the ability to resist even legitimate authority when it conflicted with their primary duty. His questions revealed a fascination with the psychological and institutional mechanisms that created such dedicated service. The commander's responses were professional, but guarded. She explained that the selection process for royal guards was extensive, involving not just physical and tactical training but psychological evaluation and character assessment. The guards who made it through the program had demonstrated not just skill, but the moral strength to maintain their principles under pressure. Their conversation was interrupted by the formal requirements of the reception, but Trump's interest in the subject was clearly not satisfied. Throughout the afternoon's events, he continued to observe the guards and their interactions with their commander. He seemed to be studying them, trying to understand what made them different from the military and security personnel he was accustomed to commanding. During a quiet moment in the reception, one of Trump's senior advisors approached him to discuss the implications of the earlier confrontation. The advisor was concerned about potential diplomatic fallout and wanted to understand whether any damage control measures were needed. The conversation was brief but intense, conducted in whispers to avoid attracting attention. Trump dismissed his advisor's concerns, insisting that the confrontation had been a learning experience rather than a diplomatic failure. He claimed to have gained valuable insights into the nature of loyalty and service, though his advisor remained skeptical about the wisdom of testing foreign security forces in such a direct manner. Meanwhile, the Royal Guards continued their duties with unwavering professionalism. They had processed the earlier confrontation and filed it away as an unusual but manageable incident. Their training had prepared them for unexpected challenges, and they had met this one successfully while maintaining their integrity and effectiveness. The monarch had managed to piece together some details of what had occurred from subtle observations and brief communications with their commander. They were not surprised that their guards had maintained their principles under pressure. That was exactly why these particular individuals had been selected for this elite service. However, they were concerned about the potential implications for ongoing diplomatic relationships. As the afternoon progressed, Trump seemed to develop a grudging respect for the guards' unwavering discipline. He had tested them and found them unbreakable, which was something he could appreciate even if he didn't fully understand it. His earlier frustration was giving way to a more complex mixture of admiration and puzzlement. The commander noticed this shift in the president's attitude and began to relax slightly. She had been prepared for continued challenges or attempts at retaliation, but instead she saw signs that Trump was processing the experience in a more constructive way. Her guards had done exactly what they were trained to do, and they had earned respect through their steadfast performance. During the formal dinner that evening, Trump made several remarks about the professionalism and dedication of the Royal Guard detail. His comments were clearly intended as compliments, though they also revealed his continued fascination with their resistance to his authority. He seemed to view them as an interesting puzzle that he was still trying to solve. The guards themselves maintained their positions and focus throughout the evening's events, but they were aware of the president's continued attention. They had successfully navigated a challenging situation and demonstrated the principles that guided their service. The confrontation had tested them, but it had also proven the strength of their training and commitment. As the day drew toward its conclusion, it became clear that the encounter on the South Lawn had changed something fundamental in how Trump viewed authority and loyalty. He had discovered that there were forms of power that operated entirely outside his sphere of influence, and this discovery would continue to intrigue him long after the royal visit had ended. The evening state dinner proceeded with all the grandeur and protocol that such occasions demanded. But for Trump, the formal conversations and ceremonial toasts could not distract him from his continued fascination with the royal guards. They stood at their assigned positions around the dining room, their presence both protective and ceremonial, embodying a tradition that stretched back centuries. During a break between courses, Trump made an unexpected decision. He approached the monarch directly and asked for a private moment to discuss the afternoon's events. The request was unusual but not entirely inappropriate, and the monarch agreed to step aside for a brief conversation away from the other guests and dignitaries. In the quiet of a side room, Trump found himself in the unusual position of essentially apologizing to a foreign head of state for testing their security detail. He explained that his actions had been motivated by curiosity rather than any desire to create problems, though he acknowledged that his approach had been inappropriate. The monarch listened with the patience that comes from decades of dealing with various personalities in international relations. The monarch's response revealed both understanding and subtle reproach. They explained that their guards were not merely employees but individuals who had dedicated their lives to service based on principles that transcended politics and geography. The guards' refusal to follow Trump's orders was not personal defiance but adherence to oaths that formed the foundation of their identity and purpose. Trump found himself genuinely listening to this explanation in a way that surprised even him. The monarch spoke about loyalty not as blind obedience but as a conscious choice to serve something greater than oneself. They described how their guards had been selected not just for their physical capabilities but for their moral strength and unwavering character. The conversation continued with the monarch sharing stories of their guards' service in various challenging situations around the world. They spoke of guards who had risked their lives to protect not just the royal family, but the principles of service and honor that they represented. These were not just soldiers or security personnel, but individuals who had chosen to embody certain ideals. Trump asked about the selection and training process that produced such dedicated individuals. The monarch explained that it took years to develop a royal guard, involving not just physical training but education in history, philosophy, and ethics. The guards needed to understand not just how to protect someone, but why their service mattered in a larger context. This discussion began to give Trump a different perspective on what he had witnessed earlier. The guards' resistance to his authority was not about personal defiance or diplomatic protocol, but about maintaining integrity in the face of competing demands. They had chosen their path carefully and completely, and that choice could not be overridden by external pressure. The monarch also shared their own perspective on leadership and authority. They explained that true power came not from the ability to command obedience, but from earning loyalty through consistent demonstration of worthiness. The guards followed their orders not because they had to, but because they believed in the values and purposes those orders represented. As their conversation drew to a close, the monarch made an observation that would stay with Trump long after the visit ended. They suggested that perhaps the most impressive aspect of their guards' performance that afternoon was not their refusal to follow his orders, but their ability to maintain respect for him even while refusing to comply. They had managed to be both firm and courteous, both principled and diplomatic. Returning to the dinner, Trump found himself observing the guards with new eyes. He began to notice details he had missed before. The way they communicated with subtle gestures, how they positioned themselves to protect not just their sovereign but other guests as well, and how they maintained constant awareness without appearing threatening or intrusive. During the remainder of the evening, Trump made several attempts to engage individual guards in brief conversations. His approach was different now, more respectful and genuinely curious rather than challenging. He asked about their backgrounds, their training, and their experiences in service. The guards responded politely but briefly, maintaining their professional demeanor while showing appropriate courtesy to a head of state. One particular exchange stood out when Trump spoke with the guard who had been the original focus of his orders that afternoon. The guard showed no resentment or awkwardness about the earlier confrontation, treating the president with the same professional respect he would show any dignitary. This grace under pressure impressed Trump more than he expected it would. The commander watched these interactions carefully, noting the change in the president's approach and demeanor. She had seen many powerful people struggle to understand the nature of her guard service, and she recognized that Trump was genuinely trying to comprehend something that challenged his usual understanding of authority and power. As the evening progressed, Trump found himself thinking about his own security detail and military advisors. He began to wonder about the differences between loyalty based on duty and hierarchy versus loyalty based on shared principles and values. The Royal Guards had demonstrated something that seemed both foreign and admirable to his experience. The formal dinner concluded with the traditional toasts and expressions of friendship between the two nations. Trump's remarks included specific praise for the professionalism and dedication of the Royal Guard detail, though he carefully avoided any reference to the afternoon's confrontation. His words carried genuine respect that had been earned through the day's events. After the guests had departed and the formal ceremonies were concluded, Trump requested one final meeting with the commander. This time, his approach was entirely different from their morning encounter. He spoke with her as one leader to another, acknowledging that he had learned something valuable from observing her guards in action. The commander responded with professional courtesy, but she could see that the president's understanding had genuinely evolved throughout the day. She explained that her guard's strength came not from rigidity, but from flexibility within principles. They could adapt to almost any situation while maintaining their core commitments and values. Trump asked what advice she might give to someone trying to build that kind of loyalty and dedication in their own organization. The commander's response was thoughtful and practical. She spoke about the importance of clear values, consistent leadership, and the need to demonstrate that service was about something greater than personal advancement or temporary goals. Their conversation revealed that Trump had been genuinely affected by witnessing a form of service that operated on principles he had not fully understood before. The guards had shown him that true strength sometimes meant saying no to power rather than always saying yes. This was a lesson that would resonate with him in ways he was only beginning to recognize. As the commander prepared to leave, she made one final observation that captured the essence of what had occurred that day. She told Trump that his willingness to listen and learn from the afternoon's events showed the kind of leadership that could earn genuine respect rather than mere compliance. It was a compliment that carried particular weight coming from someone who had just demonstrated the difference between the two. The royal visit was drawing to its close, but the impact of the day's events was just beginning to unfold. Trump had encountered something rare in his experience, a group of individuals whose loyalty could not be bought, commanded, or intimidated. They had remained respectful throughout their resistance, professional in their defiance, and gracious in their victory. The guards themselves had successfully navigated an unprecedented challenge while maintaining their integrity and effectiveness. They had proven that their principles were not merely theoretical, but practical guidelines that could withstand real pressure from real authority. Their performance had honored both their oath and their profession. As the evening ended and preparations began for the next day's departure ceremonies, it was clear that everyone involved had been changed by the day's events. The confrontation on the South Lawn had become a moment of education and mutual respect, demonstrating that even conflicts could lead to understanding when handled with dignity and principle. The morning of the royal departure arrived with the crisp efficiency that characterized all aspects of the visit. The guards had maintained their vigilance throughout the night, rotating shifts with the precision that came from years of practice. As dawn broke over the White House grounds, they began the careful process of preparing for their sovereign's departure while maintaining security until the final moment. Trump rose earlier than usual that morning, drawn by a restlessness that he couldn't quite explain. The events of the previous day had left him with thoughts and questions that sleep had not resolved. He found himself at his office window once again, watching the guards as they conducted their morning preparations with the same methodical precision he had observed upon their arrival. The departure ceremony would be simpler than the arrival, but it required the same level of coordination and attention to detail. The guards moved through their preparations with quiet efficiency, each knowing their role and executing it flawlessly. Their professionalism remained as impressive as it had been throughout the visit. Unaffected by the previous day's confrontation, the commander conducted a final briefing with her team, reviewing the departure timeline and security arrangements. She noticed that several White House staff members were observing their operations with obvious interest, word having spread about the previous day's events. The attention didn't affect her guards' performance, but she remained aware of the scrutiny they were under. Trump made an unexpected appearance on the South Lawn during the guards' final preparations. His presence was noted immediately, and the commander approached to inquire if he needed anything. Her manner was professional and courteous, showing no lingering tension from their earlier encounters. The president's response surprised her with its thoughtfulness and genuine respect. He told her that he had come to observe their departure preparations because he wanted to better understand the systematic approach they brought to their duties. Trump acknowledged that he had learned something valuable from watching how they operated as a cohesive unit guided by shared principles, rather than just individual commands. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared during the visit. Trump asked thoughtful questions about leadership, loyalty, and the development of institutional culture. The commander found herself explaining concepts that she rarely had occasion to discuss with outsiders, particularly heads of state who operated in very different environments. She spoke about the importance of building trust through consistent behavior over time, rather than demanding immediate compliance through authority alone. The guards' loyalty had been earned through years of proving that their leaders would never ask them to compromise their principles or act against their better judgment. This trust formed the foundation of their effectiveness. Trump seemed particularly interested in how the guards maintained their standards across different countries and cultural contexts. The commander explained that their principles were portable because they were based on universal concepts of honor, duty, and service, rather than specific political or cultural preferences. This allowed them to operate effectively anywhere in the world. As they talked, other guards continued their preparations around them, demonstrating the very concepts the commander was describing. They worked independently but in coordination, each taking initiative within their areas of responsibility, while maintaining awareness of the larger mission. Their efficiency was remarkable but never seemed rushed or stressed. The arriving vehicles for the departure ceremony provided a natural conclusion to their conversation. The commander thanked Trump for his hospitality and acknowledged that the visit had been educational for her as well. She had gained insights into American perspectives on security and leadership that would inform her future operations. Trump's response revealed how much the experience had affected him. He admitted that he had approached the confrontation with assumptions about authority and compliance that had proven incomplete. The guards had shown him that respect could be maintained even while refusing to compromise principles, and that true strength sometimes required saying no to power. The formal departure ceremony proceeded with the same precision and dignity that had characterized the entire visit. The royal party took their positions while the guards maintained their protective formation, ready to transition from stationary security to mobile protection. Their movements were fluid and professional, demonstrating the adaptability that made them effective in various situations. As the royal vehicle prepared to depart, the monarch made a point of personally thanking Trump for his hospitality. Their brief exchange included subtle references to the lessons that both sides had learned during the visit. The monarch expressed hope that the stronger understanding between their nations would continue to develop through future interactions. Trump found himself genuinely moved by the departure ceremony, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps it was seeing the guards maintain their dedication and professionalism, even in the final moments of their mission. Or perhaps it was recognizing that he had witnessed something rare and valuable that he wanted to better understand. The commander's final action before departing was to approach Trump one last time. She presented him with a small ceremonial item, a token of respect from her unit to acknowledge the educational nature of their interaction. The gesture was both diplomatic and personal, recognizing that their confrontation had led to mutual understanding rather than lasting conflict. As the motorcade pulled away from the White House, Trump stood watching until it disappeared from view. The ground seemed unusually quiet after the departure of the guards, their absence making clear how much their presence had contributed to the atmosphere of the visit. The experience had given him new perspectives on leadership, loyalty, and the nature of true authority. In the days and weeks that followed, Trump would find himself referring back to the lessons he had learned from the Royal Guards. Their demonstration of principled resistance had shown him that the strongest forms of loyalty were not based on fear or obligation, but on shared values and mutual respect. It was a lesson that would influence his thinking about leadership long after the memory of their confrontation had evolved into a story of mutual education and understanding. The Royal Guards returned to their home country with their own lessons learned, having successfully navigated an unprecedented challenge while maintaining their integrity and effectiveness. They had proven that their principles were not merely theoretical, but practical guidelines that could withstand real pressure from real authority, and their performance had honored both their oath and their profession in the most demanding circumstances possible.